This was just put in front of me. This is Mike Bloomberg tonight in Houston, Texas.
I defended it, looking back, for too long because I didn't understand then the unintended pain it was causing to young black and brown families and their kids. I should have acted sooner and faster to stop it. I didn't, and for that I apologized.
Alexi, is he getting better at that? Are the questions about stop and frisk, about real estate inequities, about making too much money, is he going to be able to successfully bat them away?
I mean, I guess it remains to be seen. Polling shows that he's increasingly rising in the polls in spite of these problems coming up. But the one interesting thing, obviously the main pushback to his apology about stop and frisk is, well, he did it right before he launched his presidential campaign. So that suggests to a lot of folks that I've talked with that that was his motivating factor. He was running for president. He knew that would be a liability, and that's why he apologized. In the clip you just played, he says that he didn't realize the effects it was having on black and brown communities. But that's at odds with the fact that he is a self-described data nerd. He is someone who has access to all of this data and insights and numbers about so many different things that it's simply hard to believe that he wasn't aware of the effects of that policy and the lasting legacy of that policy until just before he launched his presidential campaign. So as he continues to rise in the polls, I fully expect other campaigns, as we've already seen this starting, will continue to slowly drip out Oppo research against him to try to knock away at his biggest vulnerabilities.
Or where the rubber will hit the road is Mike is all about data. What could be missing here is humanity. And that's what he's going to have to deliver. It's not just about the numbers. The numbers could say, if this number spits out, do X. Well, people are going to vote based on how and why they feel a certain way. And that's going to be somewhat of a roadblock. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if an upcoming slogan is, Mike Bloomberg, he fails at purity tests. He wins at everything else. We are going to see a drip, drip, drip of things Mike has said or done that are somewhat offensive. And he's most likely going to say, but by comparison, look at all of the great things that I've done. It wasn't a surprise that he apologized tonight. That was an event he hosted specifically Mike Bloomberg for Black America. If he wasn't going to apologize there, then where was he going to?
And I was going to ask you about the accoutrements of this race and everything else that money can buy. A web operation that everyone says is state of the art. Just watching the mistakes that have been made thus far in unsuccessful campaigns and trying not to do that again.
I've actually gotten to spend some time at Bloomberg headquarters. I've seen his digital operation known as Hawkfish in motion. Listen, it's a massive operation. His business, the reason he is a billionaire is because he created a data and analytics technology company.
Okay,
and the person in his mind he'll be running against, or he'd like to, is President Trump. If you've read today's Atlantic expose, President Trump has $1 billion digital campaign that some Republican strategists are calling the Death Star. So while some don't like all that Bloomberg is doing as far as an onslaught in digital, others say if somebody is going to go up against Donald Trump, he's the one person who's built the apparatus to do so.
And you have to meet President Trump where he is, which is increasingly on Facebook. A lot of the other Democratic presidential campaigns simply do not know how to use Facebook in the way that the Republican Party at large does, and certainly in the way that President Trump and his campaign in 2016 learned how to do, and is only scaling that in bigger ways in the 2020 election. Bloomberg has the money, the resources, and the team, as Stephanie was just talking about with Hawkfish, to compete toe-to-toe with President Trump online. And that's a big part of this next election.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.